you are just simply not going to be able to compete with solar plus batteries plus wind power. And countries have to just get organized accordingly. Otherwise, they're going to suffer consequences in terms of stranded assets and unemployment and the like.
One for mum, one for dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
Hello and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Leanne Minshull and I'm so glad you are here. At last week's national conference, Labor changed its party platform, adopting new language on taxing Australia's resource exports.
We should be getting a better deal out of gas. We export so much of it.
Australia only gets one chance to export its gas. It only gets one chance to tax those gas exports.
I think Australians are learning that we've been giving it away far too cheaply and that energy companies, gas companies have been taking the piss.
It was a small and long overdue step towards making the gas industry pay its fair share. But while Labor power brokers negotiated whether the final wording called for a fair return or just a fairer one, the window to sell our gas is closing. It's not just that the Australian people miss out on more than $2 million every hour we wait to implement a 25% gas export tax, even though we do. It's that the world around us is moving on from dirty energy, and the markets to sell our gas into are shrinking. According to our guest today, if Australia keeps mining more coal and gas, we could wind up with a basket full of stranded assets. Assaad Razzouk runs a clean energy company headquartered in Singapore, financing, building and operating renewable energy projects in Asia. And he joined me on Wednesday, the 8th of July. I really hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. By day, Assaad is a renewable energy businessman, and by night, he's the host of the podcast, The Angry Clean Energy Guy. So I'm a new but enthusiastic convert to this podcast, and I've actually devoured about 10 episodes since subscribing last week. It's just really fascinating. And if anybody wants a really insightful and incisive view and rundown of what's happening in the global world of energy and global energy politics, I really recommend that people have a listen. You can find the Angry Clean Energy Guy podcasts on all of the usual platforms. And so, Assaad, thanks so much for being here. And maybe I'm going to start with just asking where you're dialing in from today.
Thanks so much for that very kind introduction, Leanne. Thank you. I'm in Singapore at the moment.
Well, as I mentioned before, I have been devouring your podcasts, and I'm particularly interested to start a discussion on what you refer to as an imminent extinction event for the fossil fuel industry. And your hypothesis is that in 2025, the economics settled the debate and that solar is eating the gas market, batteries are eating the night, and EVs are eating the oil market. Could you give our listeners some data points around that, I suppose, to explain to them why this is happening? Because in Australia, we're still being told that we have to expand our gas industry, even though we're the second largest LNG exporter in the world.
Thank you for the question. I think when you are in the midst of fundamental long-term trends that are quite secular in nature, you don't notice them. Right. So you're focused on your day-to-day news flow, and you aren't taking enough of a step back enough of the times to look at what's actually going on beneath the surface, if I can put it this way. So if we look back at 2025, there are some fundamental changes that have happened and that all represent long-term trends that are just not going to go anywhere. So the first one was that clean power met 100% of all new global electricity demand growth. And that's quite the achievement. The second one is that if you look at fossil fuel electricity globally, it didn't just slow down in 2025. It actually went down, even though we were in a global economic environment where the global economy actually expanded. Then the third one is that coal lost its 100-year plus crown because its global share of the power mix went below renewables for the first time in at least 100 years. And then finally, we continued to see dramatic drops in the price of batteries and solar in that year, which means that when you combine these two to deliver firm power, we have ultra-competitive sources of electricity now that are not fossil fuel based.
So that's some quite extraordinary data points, and you'll be shocked to know, and listeners will be shocked to know, that none of that made it to the front pages of the papers in Australia. I think the fact that coal has actually lost its crown is something that we're not aware of here in Australia. And just if I can talk about the 100% of new growth met by renewable energy power, if I just make sure I've got this right. So the amount of demand that went up, the amount of growth in demand, so not all power obviously was met by RE, but the growth part of demand overall in global energy consumption was met by RE. That's really interesting because I think, and I'd love to talk to you about AI and data centres anyway, Assaad, but we hear a lot from the gas industry saying global demand for electricity is going to go up because of the prevalence of data centres and that only gas will be able to fill that extra consumption. Do you have any views on data centres and how to meet that increase in demand?
Yeah, it's not going to happen. Gas is not going to deliver the electricity that we are projecting that we're going to need because of the addition of all the data center demand that's coming through that we know of between now and 2030. And there's a couple of interesting data points that I think help think about the answer to that question. The first one is that if you wanted to get your hands on a gas turbine today, you couldn't. The queue, so to speak, because of manufacturing constraints, is 5 to 10 years in some cases. And that's just the turbine, not all the other kit around it. The second one is that, and this is quite the kind of mic drop, solar power grew 18 times faster than natural gas globally last year, 18 times. And one way to think about that is that solar growth in 2025 alone, so just what we added in terms of solar, was more than the total energy equivalent of all the LNG that passes through the Strait of Hormuz combined. And so that's just to put some scale on these numbers. And so, de facto, what's going to happen is that solar plus batteries plus wind are going to deliver the electricity that we need to power all that new electricity demand from data centers. It's just not going to be gas. I mean, that's just propaganda as far as I'm concerned.
In the middle of a global fuel crisis is the worst possible time to jeopardise these relationships or the investment that underpins them.
Australians are sick of the delay. They are sick of the excuses. It is time for Australia to have a 25% gas export tax.
They're just threatening to stop investing in new projects at a time where gas prices are through the roof. Clearly, there's a lot of money to be made. And so, I'd urge Australians, don't listen to their BS.
There's some other information that we get told quite often here in Australia. We're a large exporter of LNG to this area that we're in, sort of Asia, and the vast majority of our exports actually go to Japan and China. And then we've got smaller but still quite significant amounts that go to South Korea, Taiwan and Southeast Asia. The gas industry and some members of our parliament actually claim that that Asian markets in particular rely heavily on Australian LNG, and if we were to limit that supply, it would force the countries to use dirtier fuels, or even that the lights may go out. So this is posed to us as we need to keep exporting LNG to help the climate, to be a good neighbour, and it also helps with regional security. Have you got any views on those claims?
Well, I don't really think you need to worry about them. We're just going to let the market do what it does, and I would expect that these exports, and more importantly, the zillions of dollars of infrastructure that was built for these exports, are going to become stranded assets, probably faster than people think or are calculated. Because if you look at actually what is going on in China, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, which are the markets that you mentioned, with China being the most interesting, case study, China actually is, first of all, exporting $50 billion of electrotech in March and April alone, so in 2 months. And that's solar, wind, EVs, batteries that went to the rest of the world to electrify it. And that's more than the total value of all US LNG, oil and coal exports by 1.3 times. So you've got that coming through. You also have China building very vast amounts of solar, wind, and ultra-high voltage grids, which means that it is decreasing its dependence very rapidly on fossil fuel imports. And one of the most interesting things that happened in the Strait of Hormuz crisis is that China was able to cut its oil imports without seemingly any impact on its economy by an amount equal to the combined daily consumption of Germany, France, and the UK. So without skipping a beat, so to speak. And then you also have other factors coming through, for example, electric trucks in China, which are just eating up diesel and oil and fossil fuel demand. So if you put that picture together and then you look at what the Japanese are actually doing in terms of electricity and the Koreans, and to a lesser extent the Taiwanese, it's very easy to see that if Australian executives think they can rely on long-term Asian demand for their product, for whatever excuse that they can come up with, they're actually not looking at the technological changes that are actually reshaping their own industry. And so you're going to end up with lots of stranded assets in Australia.
I suppose from the perspective of trying to get as much revenue for Australia, for the country, rather than the companies who export the gas, at the moment there's a very strong debate on here with a lot of people calling to get more revenue from the gas that we do export. And there's a push to get a 25% flat tax, because at the moment we really don't get very much out of our gas exports at all. A lot of the gas, in fact, about 50% of the gas that's used for that becomes LNG to be exported is actually given to the companies for free. So there's a big push. People have sort of woken up to this fact and they want to get as much revenue from the exports as they can. And what I'm hearing from you is we not only need to do that, we probably want to do it quickly, because the window to get money back for our resources is closing because the market is moving on.
Yeah, that's correct. And if you look at what Australian citizens and households are actually doing, I think they get it intuitively, because people are adding solar and batteries in their homes at the biggest clip of any country in the world. Therefore democratizing the flow of money from that, while on the gas side, the money is actually captured by essentially very few people companies and their shareholders, and it's not democratized at all. So yes, that should be taxed in order for the rest of the country to capture some of the benefits before it all disappears, or at least declines rapidly.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that because Australia does have a really high uptake of solar and batteries for individuals. So for us to be thinking that other countries aren't doing the same thing and wanting the same sort of future that we're heavily invested in as householders and individuals is kind of a cognitive dissonance that I actually don't think the Australian people have got. I think that maybe the politicians and the gas exporters that are making quite a lot of money out of this are going to, quickly come up against that reality that people understand that the rest of the world's moving, and they won't be able to keep telling us that we have to expand gas because other countries need it. I wonder if you could, this is a little bit off script, Assaad, but I was thinking around what you were telling me the other day about the solar project in Indonesia that is possibly going to be pushing renewable energy into Singapore. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. I think if you take a step back, what you see is that we've had some pretty dramatic fossil fuel shocks during COVID and now during the Strait of Hormuz wars. What these meant that you had a whole bunch of fossil fuel imports dependent countries that were either paying a lot more for the oil, gas, and coal that they're importing, or seeing a lot less of it than what they needed, and therefore you had fuel shortages in many countries. And as a parenthesis, one of the ironies in Australia is how could Australia actually run out potentially of fossil fuels, as you saw during the Strait of Hormuz a crisis, that there was a risk that was going to happen. And going back to Southeast Asia, therefore, what countries are doing is they are trying to build a pan-Southeast Asia or ASEAN grid to transport electrons from solar and wind heavy rich sites across the whole area. So what you're seeing is a projects being developed that are shipping, for example, offshore wind from Vietnam to Malaysia, or solar power from Indonesia to Singapore, or hydropower from Laos to Thailand to Vietnam, and then down to Malaysia and Singapore. And these are secular trends. They're not going to stop. These are projects that are going to happen, and they're going to happen because people discovered and politicians discovered that this is about their national security. In other words, if you import oil, gas, and coal, you're not really a sovereign country because you're a hostage to the fossil fuel market. And therefore, homegrown energy is what it's about. And if I can just extend that answer one step further, the other thing that's going on, of course, which we can't forget, is artificial intelligence, right? So you have a huge push for a lot more globally, a lot more data centers, and that's the case in almost every country, which requires a lot more electricity. And we're adding something like an entire Japan-sized grid to the world over the next few years just to feed the data center demand. And countries are realizing that this is also about sovereignty. So if you have AI domestically, you can't run it on imported molecules. You have to run it on your own homegrown energy. And the only energy that's available to be deployed fast is solar batteries and wind. So you've got all these dynamics that are all pointing in the same direction, if I can put it that way.
Do you know any countries that are attaching the requirement for new data centres to have only be run on renewable energy and having to pay for that energy?
Yeah, so I do. Japan, for example, has an initiative called the Green Transformation, where it's pushing data centers into clusters away from its large population centers. One of the issues with data centers, including in Australia, is they tend to cluster around the big cities. And that's a problem because the big cities are where people need electricity, right? As opposed to data centers. So the Japanese and the Koreans both are pushing data centers away from cities and are forcing them through regulatory changes to build their own green power. And we see that
Fantastic.
trend on the ground in these countries. Yes. And look, it makes perfect sense because if they weren't going to build their own green power, where are they going to get it from? Grids are constrained. You can't get a gas turbine, and this is the cheapest alternative in any case, right? So it kind of makes sense across the board.
Oh, well, I really hope that we're going to have to push a lot harder for that type of policy in Australia. I had no reason that you would have heard this, but there's also concerns the Australian government could just give big tech a free pass to use all of our creative intellectual property. So they can just go and scrape up stories that are told by Australians and songs that are created and plays and all of that creative intellectual property. And in return, the technology companies have told us that they will build us data centers. So this is the same sort of thing that we went through with gas. I know, it's incredible. So if you think about the gas industry, they came to us and said, we want your resources and we want them pretty much for free. We know that a baker has to pay for his flour, but in our case, we want you to give the gas to us virtually for free, and in return, we'll build infrastructure to export that gas, infrastructure that should have been an internalised cost of that industry anyway. So I feel like we're about to repeat the mistake. I know they're different industries, but it's the same ideology, I suppose, that says, yes, please take our resources. In this case, it's creative resources rather than physical gas. And in return, they're going to build something that they need for their business anyway. So that, to me, is just really stupid. But on top of that, if we're not putting the kind of legislative framework around it, as Japan has done, and say, this is where you should locate them. And by the way, you have to build your own renewable energy, I think that's going to be a disaster for Australia. And I think the last thing on that is that I think that the companies might be tempted to just want to buy existing renewable energy off the grid, which is going to put a lot of pressure on the grid on our existing renewables. So look, Assaad, I hope I'm wrong. I'm glad that other countries are doing it better. And I think if people understand the security implications around having to have your data secured in your own country and not held hostage by fossil fuels, it's an important discussion that's certainly going to just roll out over the next few years. It's not going anywhere.
Yeah, I completely agree with your analysis because, in effect, what you're saying is that Australia is going to outsource its own brain to somebody else. And, and that's the issue with sovereign AI. If you outsource your brain, then you are not a sovereign nation, in essence, because people can turn that tap off anytime for any reason. And yes, that data needs to stay in Australia and it should be powered by Australian data centers that are in turn powered by homegrown energy. And it's the same for every country around the world.
I think a trap that some people are falling into is just saying, stop data centers, we can't have data centers. And it's a fight that's not the real fight. I think the real fight is, where do we want our data to be? What are the sovereign risks associated with it? And how do we make an increase in data centers because people want them? People are not going to stop using artificial intelligence or the internet. How do we actually put the right policy framework around it so that it's helping us in our energy transition rather than holding us back? It all seems so simple.
Well, It's super interesting that you said that because the podcast I just put out is exactly on that point. It's arguing that data centers are good. It's explaining why that's the case and how to do it properly, going against the grain of the conversation at the moment, which is attacking data centers, I think, as you just said, for the wrong reasons.
Mm. Just before we finish up, Assaad, is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know?
The trend is very clear. The future is very clear. And I think people have to get organized accordingly. We can't be trapped in a primitive 19th century mindset where we view energy as something finite and then we dig it up and then we burn it once and then we do it again. We've moved into a world where it's actually technology driven, and that technology follows exponential manufacturing learning curves. And what that means is that you are just simply not going to be able to compete with solar plus batteries plus wind power. And countries have to just get organized accordingly. Otherwise, they're going to suffer consequences in terms of stranded assets and unemployment and the like. And we're seeing that really around the world. And one last thing that we haven't talked about much is electric vehicles and electric trucks and electric scooters. And that is also hollowing out the oil market from the inside without people really paying too much attention to that. And if you look at the data on electric cars and trucks and two-wheelers and three-wheelers, it's quite outstanding what's going on. There are now multiple countries where the sale of electric cars is more than the sale of petrol cars on a consistent basis each month. And so the trend lines are very clear. People just have to get with the program. Otherwise, they're going to leave money and jobs and growth on the table.
I think electric vehicle sales have skyrocketed here, particularly since the petrol price and diesel has gone up so dramatically. We've got a lot of arguments here from industry about because Australia's so big that we can't have electric trucks, but even that's being broken down. That's, not holding as much as it used to, particularly with the increase in fuel prices. And one last thing is when you were talking before about that Pan-Asian cooperation around. So while you were talking, I was kind of getting this picture in my head, like there's a renewable energy collaboration that's going on in our region. It doesn't feel to me like Australia is a part of that. Are we a part of that? And is there the potential for us to be a part of that? Or is that just not possible?
It's possible. Australia is a bit far. The company that is trying or was trying to be part of that is called Sun Cable, the Australian company. But Australia is somewhat challenged because of distance. So you have to build much longer cables than anybody else. Having said that, it makes sense for Australia to be involved because Australia is incredibly richly endowed in terms of sun in particular, and has the capacity to become an engine for all of Southeast Asia or another engine for all of Southeast Asia. It's just, you just have to align policies and regulations to get that kind of thing done, because cross-border infrastructure projects that are somewhat complex, they not only take time, but they also need attention from regulators and from politicians. The one thing I will say, though, is that signing 20-year LNG export contracts today out of Australia is literally managing a structural bankruptcy in the making. And if you just put the facts together, you can just see it ahead of you. It's coming.
Yep. Structural bankruptcy. I haven't heard that term before, but I like it. Well, Assaad, it's been an absolute delight talking to you again today. And I was just so thankful that you could join us, and I'm sure that our listeners have got a lot more data points than when this 25 minutes or so started. So thanks so much.
This was such a pleasure, Leanne. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us this week. The latest Vantage Point essay from Australia Institute Press is available now. In More Fool Me, How the Gas Industry Tricked Australia, Richard Dennis examines how big gas pulled off perhaps the greatest con in Australia's history. And he outlines the simple steps we can take to fix this mess. You can pre-order it now for $19.95 or subscribe to the Vantage Point series for just $64.95 to get 4 engaging essays a year. For a limited time only, pod listeners, that's you, can use the code FOOLME, that's FOOLME, to receive a free copy of Richard's book Econobabble along with your Vantage Point subscription. Get yours now at australiainstitute.org.au/store or via the link in the show notes. This episode was recorded on Wednesday the 8th of July and some things may have changed. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Leanne Minshull. Thanks for listening.